Radio Free Maine presents God and War at Yale. Sponsored by Historians Against the War, Reclaiming the Prophetic Voice, Yale Alumni for Social Justice, and the Yale Peace Coalition. Recorded on Thursday, April 28, 2005, at Battelle Chapel on the campus of Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. Presenters include David McDonough, Staughton Lynd, Michael Ferber, Warren Goldstein, William Sloane Coffin, David Mitchell, and Allie Perry.
Frederick Streets, my nickname is Jerry. I'm the university chaplain here at Yale and senior pastor of the Church of Christ in Yale. Welcome to this gathering. This distinguished panel of Yale alumni demonstrates the history of anti-war activism in New Haven. They will discuss the legacy of draft resistance activity at Yale, a legacy that is of increasing importance in our own turbulent times. I know each of you know perhaps all the panelists, or at least some of them. Allow me to briefly introduce each of them, after which each panel member will make a presentation in the area of 7 to 10 minutes. And following their comments, we will have opportunities for questions and answers, a brief moment of conversation, and then a concluding remark and a closing benediction by one of our panelists, whom I will also present. So joining us today is David McDonough, who is the grandson of lifelong nonviolent activist Dave Dellinger, author of From Yale to Jail, who was also a key figure in the anti-war movement and member of the famous Chicago 8 trial. Mr. McDonough attends Wheaton College. Would you identify yourself, sir? David Mitchell resisted the draft during the Vietnam War on the grounds that the U.S. government was guilty of war crimes under the Nuremberg Principles. His 1965 trial in New Haven received national attention, and many believe that the judge moved the date in an effort to complete the trial before Yale students returned to school. He served 2 years in jail. David Mitchell. Staughton Lynd, professor of history at Yale from 1964 to 1967, a Quaker and conscientious objector during the Korean War, who later chaired the first march on Washington against the Vietnam War in 1965. Lynd also made a controversial trip to Hanoi in 1966 while a professor at Yale. This trip gained national attention, sparking much concern on the Yale campus. Staughton Lynd. Michael Ferber, currently a professor at the University of New Hampshire, was a student organizer in the anti-Vietnam War movement. He was indicted, tried, and convicted, along with Dr. Benjamin Spock and our beloved William Sloane Coffin, for encouraging draft resistance in what became the famous Boston 5 case. Michael Ferber. Warren Goldstein earned his BA and PhD in American Studies from Yale and is currently professor and chair of history at the University of Hartford. He is the author of William Sloane Coffin, A Holy Impatience, Yale University Press. The book is available at the back of the sanctuary at Barnes & Noble and at the Yale Divinity Bookstore, and there's bootleg versions on Whaley Avenue and Dixwell Avenue, too. I will introduce who I have as number 6, actually last. Allie Perry holds a Master of Divinity degree from Yale and a Doctor of Ministry degree from Andover Newton Theological School. She has served as an adjunct faculty at Yale Divinity School. She is an ordained minister at the United Church of Christ. a student of liberation theology, and a social justice and peace activist committed to the practice and promotion of nonviolence, Reverend Dr. Ali Perry. Last but certainly not least, William Sloane Coffin, Yale University chaplain, 1958 to 1975, is here with us today. We're so delighted that he could be with us, and won't you join me in the most enthusiastic response to his presence. So we will hear first from David McDonough, followed by David Mitchell, and then Staughton Lynd, 1, 2, and 3, and then we will continue. Welcome, panelists.
How's it going? For those of you, excellent. For those of you who knew my grandfather, David Dellinger, you knew him as a man with very strong convictions. He was someone who many described as a moral rock. His conscience is said to be seamless. He had a tremendous reputation as a great moral character, and I think that the image that he built for himself was so strong, not just for the incredible work that he did in writing, organizing, and protesting. In other words, his involvement in events that we've gotten to know through history texts, but also, and very importantly, in the way that he stayed true to his moral conscience through everything that he did. In some of the most difficult and trying circumstances, when it would have been much easier to bend or compromise his moral values, circumstances that most people might have looked for an easier middle ground in, he was able to stand true to his beliefs. I think this is what made him such an impressive leader in the nonviolent movement for peace and justice. Furthermore, I think this is probably what made him such a successful leader, both in the larger movements towards peace and in all the smaller movements and causes that he involved himself in. And for those of you that know him, there were quite a number of those smaller causes. So the passage that I selected today, I think, just really exemplifies these characteristics that I'm talking about. His moral unwavering. It's about some of the time he spent in prison in Lewisburg for refusing to enlist to fight in World War II, and some of the adversity that he encountered as a result of being a nonviolent resistor. The passage reads as follows. Not long after I arrived at Lewisburg, 5 of us conducted a long hunger strike for abolishing the whole and eliminating the censorship of mail, books, and magazines. Winning the issue on censorship and feeling that the issue of the whole had reached a fairly wide audience on the outside, through prison visitors and progressive publicity, we stopped the strike on the 65th day after a month of force feeding. The next day I was put in the fuck-up dorm, which had a high percentage of Southern military prisoners who had committed violent crimes. One of the 2 guards who took me there addressed the prisoners as follows. This guy is one of those phonies who says he's too good to be in a regular prison with you. Now, this was a total lie. Unlike a few war objectors, I'd always opposed special classification and treatment as a political prisoner. He's a nigger lover who says that you guys should eat and sleep with the niggers and use the same toilets and showers as niggers do. True. And he's a Nazi who spits on the flag and refuses to fight for our country. And after a pause, as if to let his words sink in, we're leaving now so that you guys can take care of him. Just before they closed the door, the other guard spoke for the first time. When we come back, we hope you give him to us with his head in his hands. Now here I'll have to paraphrase what I said because I don't remember it word for word the way I remember what the guards had said. But this was the general line of attack, using street language and drawing on the things I'd learned from my earlier prison experiences. Quote, you guys know enough not to believe those hacks. That's a lot of bullshit they're trying to shove down your throats and you know it. It's the hacks who act like Nazis, not me. You know how they treat you. I've been up there in solitary fighting for you guys. 5 of us have been up there trying to get rid of the goddamn hole. We're fighting for the cons and the hacks don't like it. I know a lot of you guys have been in the hole, so I don't have to tell you what it's like. I don't have to tell you why we've been on hunger strike demanding that they stop acting like Nazis and do away with the whole once and for all. You want to know why they're telling all those lies about me? To get you and me fighting amongst ourselves instead of sticking together against them. Anyone who's been doing time like you guys have won't fall for that shit. You know the score and so do I. Now, as I was saying, I think this story demonstrates the qualities I was just discussing. The way David Dellinger conducted himself in prison, not just in this case, but the numerous other times that he went away as well, really shows his true and candid devotion to his beliefs. I think that the last couple sentences of this passage in particular really sum up this point, that in the business of nonviolent activism, running away from the inevitable threats or dangers that you will surely face will only weaken the cause, your efforts towards the cause. I also find this passage relevant to read today because, as he often said, this is where he started his education, here at Yale. But he continued in prison, oftentimes stopping back for numerous refresher courses. And just the last thing I'd like to read before I leave here is a quote that he left in the Yale class of 1936 50th reunion book. Quote, "Lest my way of life seems puritanical or austere, I always emphasize that in the long run one can't satisfactorily say no to war, violence, and injustice unless one is simultaneously saying yes to life, love, and laughter." And that's all I've written today.
Good morning. My name is David Mitchell. I'd like to thank all the organizers and hosts of this event for inviting me. I'm honored to be participating in this event with people who have played such an important part in many struggles for change in this country over the past half century or more. In reference to David's previous remarks, it was my privilege to have known his grandfather, David Dellinger, who I met in the early 1960s. At one point, I remember visiting Glen Gardner, New Jersey community where Dave Dellinger lived with his family and others and published the magazine Liberation. I was both educated and inspired by knowing him. Because of his openness and tolerance and his depth of understanding, he was often a bridge between various factions of the broader movement for peace and justice. Also, coincidentally and pertinent to our meeting here in New Haven today, my own grandfather was in the class of 1911 at Yale Law School, where he was a classmate of David Dellinger's father, Raymond Pennington Dellinger. It's a small world after all. This month marks 30 years since the United States withdrew from Vietnam, since the end of that war. As for my past, 40 years ago in September 1965, I was tried and convicted in the federal court in New Haven for draft resistance during the Vietnam War. Before I discuss the specifics of my case, I would like to point out that there is a long tradition in this country of disassociation or non-cooperation with what are considered unjust or immoral policies of our government, based on an individual's conscience and an individual's responsibility for one's participation in events. Usually this activity loosely is referred to as civil disobedience, although technically that term defines only one variant of the resistance. For example, in the 1700s, John Woolman and the Quakers refused to pay taxes levied for war against Native Americans. Alice and Staughton Lynd have edited a book, Nonviolence in America, a documentary history which illuminates much of this rich tradition from the early Quakers and through the abolitionists up to the more recent activity of the trade union movement, civil rights movement, in objections and in resistance to various wars and militarism. Notably, in contributing to the development of my own draft resistance in the 1960s was the refusal by Henry David Thoreau in the 1840s to pay a poll tax for a number of years because of his opposition to slavery and the Mexican War. A war also opposed at the time by a congressman named Abraham Lincoln, who thereafter lost his congressional seat. Thoreau went to jail for a short period as a result of his tax refusal. In connection with this action, Thoreau wrote an essay on civil disobedience. Therein, Thoreau set forth a position that the act of non-participation or saying no to your government was not simply an individual withdrawal from injustice to satisfy one's own conscience, but also a step in confronting the government and attempting to affect social change. In my specific case, I initially followed the law and registered for the draft at the age of 18. Then, in response to U.S. policies and our developing involvement in Vietnam, I refused to cooperate with the draft because it was being used to implement illegal and immoral policies and actions in Vietnam. I was a member of an End the Draft group opposed to the war and the draft. The group's statement read in part, "In the tradition of Thoreau and the principles of individual guilt and individual responsibility established in the Nuremberg trials and in the first session of the United Nations, We assert the right and the obligation of the individual to protest and disassociate himself from these criminal preparations." Close quote. My own disassociation or non-cooperation meant that I refused to report for a physical, refused to fill out any forms. I even refused to apply for an exemption from service as a conscientious objector, a CO. While my actions certainly were based on a sense of individual responsibility and the need to satisfy my own conscience and integrity by non-participation, I also hoped to create a forum on the issues to attempt to effect change. As I wrote in an article in 1964, in my own case, my draft refusal rests not on an abstract philosophy, but on the political situation as it exists. I non-cooperate with my government, not because I am a pacifist or occupy a position somehow involved with the world, but on the contrary, because I am very involved and specifically condemn the United States for crimes against peace and humanity. I refuse to cooperate with the Koreas, Cuban invasions or blockades, Vietnam, or with the arrogance with which she threatened to blow up the world. In response, my draft board declared me delinquent and ordered me for induction into the armed forces. Eventually, I was arrested and tried in New Haven in 1965. I was convicted, but my conviction was overturned. Then I was retried in Hartford in 1966. Once again, I was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. I served 2 years and the remainder on parole. I remained out on bail during the appeal process because of the generosity of Yale Law School Professor Thomas I. Emerson. Although he didn't know me personally, he put up his house to secure my bond. I took a legal position that the United States policies, particularly in Vietnam, were in violation of international law, as set forth in the United Nations Charter and various other treaties and conventions to which the United States was a party. Under our Constitution, treaties that we sign are part of the supreme law of the land. I argued that the United States policies must be judged by the principles of the Nuremberg trials, under which we had tried the Germans after World War II. At those trials, we had declared that an aggressive war was a crime against the peace, and various types of conduct during war were classified as war crimes or crimes against humanity. Individual responsibility was imposed by Nuremberg. The Nuremberg principles were part of a treaty, the Treaty of London, to which the United States was a signatory. As Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, the leading prosecutor at Nuremberg, stated, quote, "If certain acts in violation of treaties are crimes, they are crimes whether the United States does them or whether Germany does them, and we are not prepared to lay down a rule of criminal conduct against others which we would not be willing to have invoked against us," close quote. Of course, the courts did not want to deal with my defense that the application of the draft for criminal policies was illegal, and therefore my refusal to cooperate with the draft used for such purposes was justified. Allowing my defense would have subjected the United States policies and conduct in Vietnam to scrutiny and to a potential finding that they were illegal. Instead, the jury was only allowed to decide the uncontested issue of whether or not I reported for induction. My case went up to the Supreme Court, which denied review. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas disagreed and wrote that these issues should be addressed, especially since the Nuremberg precedent purports to lay down a standard of conduct for all the signatories. Similar arguments in relation to international law assessed or later were raised in 1966 by 3 soldiers who refused to be deployed to Vietnam. The 3, James Johnson, Dennis Mora, and David Samos, came to be known as the 4-3. Their case also was denied review by the Supreme Court, but this time another justice, Justice Potter, joined Justice Douglas in voting for review. Subsequently, the state of Massachusetts also sued the government on behalf of its citizens subject to the draft, asserting that they could not be drafted for the illegal Vietnam War. On September 25, 1965, William F. Buckley, Jr., a rather well-known Yale graduate, wrote in his newspaper column on the right about my case, a piece entitled, "The Nuremberg Doctrine is Raised and It Was Just a Matter of Time." He wrote in conclusion to his column, I am glad I didn't have Judge Timber's job, the judge in New Haven in my first trial. Oh, I could have scolded Mr. Mitchell along with the best of them, but I'd have had to cough and wheeze and clear my throat during that passage in my catechism at which I explained to Mr. Mitchell wherein the Nuremberg Doctrine was obviously not at his disposal. Close quote. While the courts would not hear these issues, many citizens did. By the late 1960s, a large movement of protests against the Vietnam War with draft resistance and draft card burnings, teach-ins, student strikes, etc. had developed. Michael Ferber and Staughton Lynd, who are both here today, jointly wrote a book about this period called The Resistance. Many different people with different positions and different strategies were part of this movement that collectively made a difference to end the war. For example, in stark and regrettable contrast to his more recent position on Iraq, John Kerry, yet another Yale graduate, after serving in Vietnam, returned to become a leader in Vietnam veterans against the war. And we watched as he threw his Vietnam medals or ribbons over the White House gates in protest. He eloquently condemned the Vietnam War in his April 23, 1971 statement before the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Kerry testified to the Senate about the Winter Soldier investigation held in Detroit in 1971, where returning soldiers testified about their experiences in Vietnam. Among other things, Kerry testified about, quote, war crimes, close quote, in Vietnam, in violation of international conventions that also revealed an underlying racism towards Vietnamese. He testified, quote, these were not isolated incidents but crimes committed on a day-to-day basis with full awareness of officers at all levels of command, close quote. And he said, quote, each day, someone has to give up his life so that the United States doesn't have to admit something that the entire world already knows, so that we can't say that we have made a mistake, close quote. A mistake finally admitted by Robert McNamara, an architect of the Vietnam War some 30 years later. But unfortunately, the policy in Vietnam and now the policy of war and continuing occupation in Iraq are far more serious and deeply rooted than a mistake. And our history is plagued with issues and scars of empire. Fortunately, our history is also rich with dissent and resistance. I mentioned before the opposition of Thoreau and others to the Mexican War in the 1840s. In the early 1900s, Mark Twain, among others, became a spokesperson for the anti-imperialist movement opposing American actions in the Philippines and elsewhere. He wrote during that period, quote, against our traditions we are entering upon an unjust and trivial war, a war against a helpless people for a base object, robbery. And in 1990 he stated to the press, I am an anti-imperialist. I am opposed to having the eagle put its talons on any other land. And in a statement with uncomfortable parallels with the news of our day, Mark Twain, William Dean Howells, and others signed an anti-imperialist league petition about the Philippine Island War, which along with seeking peace efforts also urged in part that, quote, steps be taken at once to stop the killing of prisoners, the shooting without trial of suspected persons, the use of torture, the wanton destruction of private property, and everywhere the barbarous methods of waging war, which this nation from its infancy has ever condemned, close quote. In Iraq now we are engaged in a, quote, preventive war and occupation. Howard Dean, in describing the Bush Doctrine in 2003, said, quote, the people of this country must understand that this administration has a far different concept of America in the world. This concept involves imposing our will on sovereign nations. This concept involves dismantling the multilateral institutions that we have spent decades building. And this concept involves distorting the rule of law to suit their narrow purposes, close quote. Actually, we have spent hundreds of years developing international laws and conventions to stabilize international relations, safeguard the sovereignty of nations, and keep the peace under the rule of law. We can go back at least to the Westphalia Treaty of 1648 to see attempts to limit the use of war as an instrument of national policy. The prohibition against aggressive war is an essential and fundamental tenet of international law. Under the United Nations Charter, war is permitted only for self-defense or when authorized by the UN Security Council in pursuance of its role to, quote, maintain or restore international peace and security. Otherwise, the UN Charter prohibits, quote, the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Since the UN Charter is part of the supreme law of the land under our Constitution, we trample our own laws as well as international law by our attack on occupation of Iraq. Without an imminent threat of attack or UN authorization, the congressional authorization for war and the attack on Iraq and the continuing occupation is lawless and aggressive under international law, constituting a crime against peace under the Nuremberg precedents. The Iraqi people have been devastated by the sanctions, the conduct of the war, and the continuing occupation, which have led to tens of thousands of deaths, the obliteration of whole cities like Fallujah, the deformities from depleted uranium, the torture and ill-treatment of prisoners, the plunder and wanton destruction of property and infrastructure. These acts constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. But the effects of the war are not just in Iraq, the death toll of U.S. soldiers is growing, as are the numbers of those coming back disabled physically and or psychologically. This month, U.S. Army Corporal Manuel Manny Lopez was the first resident of Rockland County, New York, where I live, to die in Iraq. More and more families and communities are being touched by this war. The state of Vermont has lost more National Guard members per capita than any other state. In about 50 Vermont towns have voted for the state to consider recalling its National Guard. More and more returning soldiers are speaking out, or like Camijo Mejia and Kevin Benderman, refusing to redeploy. Others are seeking asylum in Canada, and desertion rates are growing. We must support these actions and continue to struggle for change. Thank you.
As our next presenters come, I want to make sure that we acknowledge the Historians Against the War and the leadership efforts of Professor Carl Mira, Department of American Studies and Social Studies at SUNY College at Old Westbury. Carl, where are you? I know there he is. Would you please stand? Thank you for... Michael Ferber, Warren Goldstein, and then William Sloane Coffin. I'm sorry.
Well, thank goodness we finally have an objective historian to sort us all out. And so I can introduce myself in the words of page 147 as Bill Coffin's leftist friend. And Bill, on behalf of all your friends, I want to say what a joy it is to be able to thank you for all that you said and all that you did and all that you were during the 1960s here at Yale. David Mitchell remarked that the day after tomorrow will be the 30th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War, and I understand that the event will be recognized at the New Haven Colony Historical Society. But Yale has not been able to put to rest its own encounter with that war. 2 members of Skull and Bones recently sought the presidency. One anxious to conceal the details of his military service, the other afraid to take credit for his finest hour, his testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 1971. The place in which we gather tells the same story of uncertainty about the contrasting claims of God, country, and Yale. In 1967, the 450th anniversary of the Reformation, the student deacons of Battelle Chapel voted to nail a proclamation to the door declaring it a sanctuary for young men refusing military service. President Kingman Brewster told Chaplain Coffin that Battelle was university property, Bill was a university employee, and the answer was no. Both men then appealed to the faculty deacons, who backed Brewster. Coffin concluded that there was nothing to be done except to change the constitution of the church so that in the future students could have more say in its decisions. There are 2 Yales. and the Vietnam War is only one of the unresolved social issues between them. The unresolved issue of most ancient origin appears to be unionization. When David Dellinger arrived here in the fall of 1933 for the first week of his freshman year, he saw a sign in Dwight Hall inviting students to join a campaign to help the non-academic employees improve their wages and working conditions by joining a union. He enlisted. David was then summoned to a meeting with the dean. The dean, I am quoting Dellinger's autobiography, said that the campaign was organized by communists and that once I knew this, he was sure I wouldn't have anything to do with it. Sadly, the dialogue between the two Yales has not changed that much since 1933. I arrived here in the fall of 1964, fresh from a summer in which I was coordinator of Freedom Schools in the Mississippi Summer Project. A few weeks later, an extremely distinguished senior professor said to me, "Staughton, what are we going to do about the communists in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee?" I knew at the time, on the basis of firsthand experience, what I believe has since been confirmed by 40 years of scholarship, that there were no communists in SNCC. So how may we define the two Yales? The easier of the two subcultures to understand is that represented by Dellinger. In the 1930s, Dellinger went to Spain, although he did not become a soldier. In the 1960s, many of those at Yale who came to oppose the Vietnam War had previously worked for civil rights in the South. It was true of Bill Coffin and myself. It was also true of Jonathan Steele, presently editor of The Guardian, the venerable British newspaper, now strongly opposed to the war in Iraq. Another figure concerned with both civil rights and the war was a student named John Wilhelm, whom we used to call Farmer, who is a persistent organizer of trade unions at Yale, who now helps to lead one of the largest trade unions in the country, Here Unite. In July 1966, there was a meeting here in New Haven, which Michael and I describe in our book, at which 8 men pledged to return their draft cards and called on others to do the same. 3 of the 8 had been in Mississippi. Many of those at Yale who came to work against the Vietnam War shared a certain ecumenical religiosity. Unitarian for Michael Ferber, Quaker for myself, I think Presbyterian for Bill Coffin. The song most often sung at draft resistance gatherings all over the country was Amazing Grace. The folks in the other subculture who represent the other Yale are more difficult for me to describe because I was not and am not now part of their world. It goes without saying that Yale alumni constitute a network of persons in leadership positions in law, finance, academia, and government, including the CIA. According to Russell Jacoby, recently writing in The Nation, In 1951, when William Buckley published God and Man at Yale, he was then working for the CIA. I remember distinctly a moment of discovery in May 1965. I had taken my son on a birthday expedition up Mount Tom in Massachusetts. After my son fell asleep, I read a paperback book by flashlight and discovered that the man who managed the Bay of Pigs invasion was yet another Yalie in the CIA, Richard Bissell. I want to make it clear that while I accuse these men, Bissell, the Bundys, the Rostows, the Bushes, and so on, of a misguided ideological commitment to free markets and to the opportunity for unregulated investment of private capital all over the world, I do not accuse them of personal greed. In their own way, they were and are every bit as idealistic as the Dellingers, Ferbers, Lynds, and Coffins. And that is the single thing, the decency of the human beings on both sides of the divide, that makes it most difficult for Yale to bring the Vietnam War to closure. One way we can describe the interaction of the two Yales at the time of the Vietnam War is to imagine a timeline. In the mid-1960s, Bill Coffin and I used to trade impressions as to which of us was taking the most far-out and vulnerable positions. I distinctly remember Bill asking me one day in the doorway of this building whether I supported burning draft cards. I hemmed and hawed and allowed us how I did. But in the end, it was he, not I, who was indicted by the federal government. Most spokespersons for the other Yale eventually came to condemn the Vietnam War. In 1968, after Coffin had not only been indicted, but had been found guilty in the trial court, the Yale Corporation voted to give Reverend Coffin administrative tenure, that is, an indefinite contract extension. In October 1969, President Brewster stated publicly, "We cannot tolerate continuation of the killing and the dying, the perpetuation of terror and death." In 1971, John Kerry, who as an influential Yale undergraduate deplored anti-war demonstrations, told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about the winter soldier testimony that David Mitchell mentioned earlier, about rape, mutilation, torture by electric shock to the genitals, random killing, destruction of villages in a fashion reminiscent of Genghis Khan, poisoning food stocks, and the very particular ravaging which is done by the applied bombing power of this country. I recall a letter to the New York Times by the history professor who had recruited me, denouncing the massacre at My Lai in language I found indistinguishable from that used by myself and others in the anti-war movement 3 or 4 years earlier. The problem with leaving the matter there, from my point of view, is the following. In an intellectual community, one likes to think of ground gained as ground permanently possessed. Darwin propounded the theory of evolution, leaving aside occasional tremors in the red states. Evolution appears established and one moves on. Watson and Crick discovered DNA. It does not need to be periodically rediscovered. In the matter of wars between the United States and the developing world, however, with each new war, we seem to need to begin the argument all over again. The positions are always the same. There is talk about neoconservatism as if it were something new under the sun. But I think the other Yale has been neoconservative since the extermination of the Pequot Indians. Former Yale professor Wolfowitz broadcast the same mistaken platitudes that former Yale professor Eugene Rostel offered 40 years ago. To my mind, the key to the neoconservative mindset is that God, country, and Yale appear to the other Yale inextricably connected in a matrix or gestalt called freedom with capitalism. I suggest that this devotion to capitalism is the reason that the ideological war over third world revolutions has constantly to be refought, as it were, from go. Be honest. It is not the absence of democracy that offends our governing class. It is interference with private capital, which that class considers the indispensable precondition for democracy. Mossadegh in Iran, Arbenz in Guatemala, Allende in Chile, Aristide in Haiti were all democratically elected. But to one degree or another, each had taken into public control resources desired by United States corporations. The United States government, therefore, overthrew them. In Vietnam, there was not very much to be either nationalized or privatized, but Vietnam was wrongly believed to be a client state of Communist China, and Ho Chi Minh was rightly believed likely to win any free election. And so, as President Eisenhower confessed in his memoirs, the United States deliberately sabotaged the nationwide democratic election planned at the 1954 Geneva Conference. Saddam Hussein was not democratically elected, but neither were the rulers of Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. Since it was Saddam who had nationalized oil, it was he, not they, who had to be removed. Chavez in Venezuela, Lula in Brazil, perhaps the next president of Mexico, await their turns. What can be done to separate a commitment to capitalism from the devotion to God, country, and Yale? This is a question we should take away from this gathering and to which we should direct our best attention. I stand where I did 40 years ago. Just as I then traveled to Hanoi and saw at first hand the effect of United States bombing, so I have met with the mothers of young Sandinista soldiers killed in Nicaragua, with Palestinians whose children are held in indefinite administrative detention and whose homes are demolished in a form of collective punishment, with Mexican farmers who can no longer make a living because they are undersold by corn and beef from Iowa. I am not just critical of United States foreign policy, I oppose it. And I support the brave servicemen who, after seeing service in Iraq, refused to redeploy because they would be required to commit more war crimes.
Since this is an historic as well as historical occasion, I'm tempted to tell stories about Bill Coffin and Dave Dellinger and Benjamin Spock, who have all been my friends and have all made me a better person. I will tell one. Just being here in Battelle for the first time in many years reminds me of an Easter Sunday sermon I heard preached by Bill Coffin from that pulpit, which left me weeping like a baby, which came as a great surprise since I'm a Unitarian. Just as he was approaching the end of the sermon, it had been a gloomy, rainy day, and of course, like all Easter sermons, Coffin began by talking about what a gloomy world it was and made us feel really depressed. But slowly, bit by bit, he found little points of light, little threads of possibility, bits of hope, which he wove up into something that made you want to exult. And just at that point, the sun shone through those lights for the first time. That gave me a new respect for Bill Coffin's capacity to preach the Lord. But I think the best tribute I can pay to Bill and Dave and Ben Spock and others is to talk a bit more about what's going on now and what we might do about it. After all, they did. Whenever Dave Dellinger spoke, he would have tucked into his shirt pocket a little clipping from today's New York Times. So it's something in that spirit that I'd like to say a few things. And I'm not going to read it. The current peace movement, it seems to me, is quite large, but a bit sleepy and confused right now. I think a testament as to how powerful it is, or how widespread it is that several 100,000 people worked very, very hard last summer and fall, to elect a president who supported the war. That is to say, even he, the tepid and tedious and tergiversating centrist John Kerry, I learned that last word at Yale. Was anybody but Bush, and people worked terribly hard to get him elected. Had John Dean been nominated, I'm not saying he would have won, as he had his own liabilities, but the Deaniacs, imagine it, how much energy would have been pouring out onto the streets. Every doorbell in the country would have been rung 17 times by the Deaniacs. Because he and he alone, early on, among the viable candidates, opposed the war in Iraq and electrified the Democratic Party grassroots. Well, Bush won anyway, so what do? I think we've been at a low ebb and frustrated. This Congress seems hopeless to lobby, even more hopeless than the last one. So we need to turn to something else. And since this is an historical occasion, it got me thinking about how difficult it was to lobby against the war in Vietnam, in fact, for the first few years, from 1965 to 1969 in any case. I had a very good opportunity to lobby against the war in 1965 when I was home from college in Buffalo, New York. It happened that my next-door neighbor was the County Democratic Party chairman, a friend of my family's. And on his front porch one evening after dinner, I noticed sitting next to him was my congressman, who lived a few blocks away, also a friend of my family's. And I said, all right, this is a lobbying opportunity I can't pass up. I had spent the summer studying about the war in Vietnam. I'd even given a little talk on it. So I said, hi, can we talk about the war? Well, they were very polite. We had lemonade or something. And they listened. And I could tell that my congressman, who was a liberal who later went on to lead a campaign against chemical and biological weapons, was sympathetic to what I said, but the county chairman rather jocularly said, "Well, Max, as your county chairman, I must tell you to support the president's policy in Vietnam." Jocular it was, but a bit chilling. I think most of us felt we couldn't get anywhere. The liberal Democrats, the ones who would be most likely to support us, were locked into supporting a liberal Democratic president because they so admired his war on poverty and his civil rights and so on. To their own surprise, we had a more liberal Democrat than Kennedy, on domestic issues at least, and they did not dare oppose him. It was only when Nixon was elected in 1969 that you could begin again to lobby a Democratic Congress. So what were we to do? Well, as Staughton and others have reminded us this morning, we were fresh from the Civil Rights Movement, which had been the most creative center for experiments in new kinds of social protest and the making of social change. The civil rights slogan of "fill the jails," for instance, got a lot of us thinking around 1966 and 7 about what we might do equivalently in the North with respect to the war. Martin Luther King had studied his Gandhi. Gandhi had studied what happened in 1905 in Russia. There was now suddenly, for us at least, a continuous tradition of nonviolent social protest with interesting new strategies that we could draw from. And so, partly in that spirit, a group called The Resistance in California emerged, and they began in typical California style to organize the rest of the country. There were 4 guys, actually. 3 of them worked on California, and the other took care of the rest of the country. He came east. We met. Several others were impressed by this idea that towards the end of the year, groups all around the country of young draftable men would return their draft cards to their draft boards or to the FBI. Not burn them, but return them, with a note saying that they are not going to cooperate with the draft, and if convicted of draft refusal, would not go to Canada but stay here, and if necessary, go to prison. We'd fill the prisons. That seemed a little wacky to me at first. Fill the federal prison system? But in fact, the federal prison system was rather small, and the federal court system was rather small. It's grown a bit, I think, since then, but there were not that many federal crimes. Most crimes are state crimes, but anything connected with the draft is a federal crime. Also, shooting and killing a bald eagle, we found, was a federal crime. But not too many others, except treason and so on. So the plan was, let's turn in draft cards, let's stay here, let's set an example, and above all, let's do something which is both creative and nonviolent, because the ordinary channels of protest seemed clogged, seemed hopeless. We could not get through, even though public opinion was turning on our side. I joined this group then in the fall of 1967, thanks ultimately to David Dellinger, who by a great stroke of good luck turned out to be the father of the freshman across the hall from me at Swarthmore College in 1962. Patch was his name, now a surgeon. He seemed destined to become one with that name. His father and the rest of the family showed up soon to visit, and I learned from David Dellinger what a real pacifist could be, what courage could be. He made an excellent mentor and served as a kind of model that I could never live up to, but a model to aspire toward in decisions in my own life regarding peace and justice. Well, within a couple of years, several thousand young men did turn in draft cards with letters to their draft boards. Bill and Ben Spock and many others turned them over to the Justice Department in Washington from the first round that came in that first fall. There were trials, not just our own more famous one, but many smaller individual trials of draft resistors, and it did have an effect. It was hard to measure at the time. It's still a little hard to measure in retrospect, but there's a new book out on it that has come of research in the LBJ library, and there's now pretty good evidence that the National Security Council under Johnson was very worried about draft resistance, particularly when General Westmoreland came back in 1968 and asked for 200,000 more troops. Out came the calculators, How do we get 200,000 more troops? Well, we would need to increase draft calls by a good deal more than that. And that was precisely when people were turning in their draft cards and saying, we won't go. So General Westmoreland was turned down, and that put a ceiling on the number of soldiers in Vietnam. And since the war could only be won on the ground, that was a turning point in the war. Of course, the air war went on for many years, but by then it was possible to lobby Congress because a Republican president had inherited the war and continued it. And within a few years, Congress was able to put a stop to it. What do we learn from that kind of experience? And there are many other examples of nonviolence I could cite, but that's the one I know best and most relevant, perhaps, to war. The first thing I think you learn from this is you never know what might work. I mean, it was a wacky idea. I thought it was nuts at first. My mother thought it was nuts after I joined it. It was only when I was indicted with Dr. Spock that she began to cheer up. You don't know what will work. You cast your bread on the waters. Maybe they come back. Maybe something will have an effect. We had some hints at the time, Staughton and I were aware of this, that what was going on behind the scenes in the National Security Council was affected by what we did, but the evidence wasn't really clear for a long time. You don't know. So try anything, try everything that makes sense, as long as you're true to principles of nonviolence and democracy. We learned, too, that changes certainly don't come from the top. I mean, eventually Congress voted to cut off funds for the war, but that was only after 10 years of turmoil in the streets and draft resistors and military resistors and deserters and so on. Will the draft come back? Can we apply these lessons even more closely? I'm sure I don't know. There are pretty strong pressures against bringing a draft back. The official view on all hands is that the all-voluntary Army is the best way to go. We don't want a draft. I'm sure the Bush administration realizes it would be political dynamite to bring a draft back. But I think it's also obvious, as you just read the newspaper, that we've run out of men and women, especially men, where there's nobody else we can send to Iraq. The reserves, the ready reserves, the National Guard have been drained dry by their own admission, and recruiters, though their numbers have doubled, are not producing enough men for the armed forces, or women for the armed forces. The Marines fell short last month for the first time in several years. The Army fell short by a third of its monthly quota. It was short the month before that. There simply aren't enough men even to continue, I think, the present occupation in Iraq and Afghanistan, let alone go on to Tehran, which was the original plan. And we now know that many members of Congress, including liberals, are saying we should increase the size of the armed forces by 30,000 people, but they can't do it. So I think the pressure to have a draft is increasing also. I don't know how it's going to come out. We don't know. But again, we didn't know anything then either during the Vietnam War. So I think it's not too soon for people to think about draft resistance. It's not too soon for young men and women now to issue statements saying they will not go, they will not serve in Iraq. If nothing else, that would be a shot across the bow, if you'll pardon the military metaphor, of the Bush administration to say, all right, if the draft is on your list of possibilities, this is what you will face, in order to make the pressures that much harder on them and to make it harder for them to find the person power to continue the war or expand it. So I hope we'll do this. I hope we'll learn something that we had a very hard time managing last time, and I'll conclude with this. Though we turned in draft cards together, often at church services, or in some cases soldiers deserted the army together or went AWOL together, we all did prison time separately. You go to jail alone, you go to court alone, and it was hard for many of them to sustain their commitments over the years it sometimes took. We tried to create communities of support, and in some cities they weren't too bad. We had prison visitors, we had letter writers, we had a lot we could do, and we did our best to publicize these cases. We need to do that better even now with the cases we have. There's no formal draft in place, but we already have refusers. We have soldiers refusing to go, as we heard earlier. These people need to be celebrated. These people need to be told that they are doing something brave and honorable. Most of them are brave enough to go to prison, or they wouldn't have done this. But it can be a lonely and terrifying thing, and we need to do our best to keep in touch with them. And I think we can take steps now as a community of mostly older people to do that. We have, after all, a few advantages now that we lacked 30 or 40 years ago. First of all, a lot of us are still around, right? We did it then, we can do it again, at least in a supportive way, for the younger people who will be refusing. And we have the advantage of another 30 or 40 years of seeing experiments in nonviolence all around the world. We can read Gene Sharp's books about the history and theory of nonviolence. We didn't have them in the 1960s. We were just beginning to get them. We knew about Gandhi, we knew about Martin Luther King, but now we know about solidarity in Poland. We know about the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, or the opposition to Marcos in the Philippines, or the Ukraine just a few weeks ago, or the rising against Milosevic a few years ago in Serbia. We've seen perhaps the greatest gift that the 20th century has given us amidst war and genocide. It's given us the gift of massive, thoughtful, planned, nonviolent political action. We've learned from it. We can learn from it. And I think this gives us a better chance to do the right thing this time around. Thank you.